to the computer. All right, the recording is live. Welcome everybody. Happy to have you here at this end of the month Federalist Society meeting for SLU Law. I want to do a quick introduction of our group and then of our speaker, and we can get right to it. So the Federalist Society for Law and Public Policy Studies is the long name for FedSoc. It's a group of conservative and libertarian law students, lawyers, professors, and judges interested in the current state of the legal order. It is founded on the principles that the state exists to preserve freedom, that the separation of governmental powers is central to our Constitution, and that it is emphatically the province and duty of the judiciary to say what the law is, not what it should be. To that extent, and to talk a little bit about international relations today, we're happy to host Ms. Ying Ma. She is a writer, policy expert, and communications professional. She's a member of the board of advisors for the Claire Booth Luce Policy Institute, an organization that prepares young women for effective leadership and promotes leading conservative women. She's also the author of Chinese Girl in the Ghetto, a memoir about getting to know freedom from post-Mao China to inner city Oakland. As a side note there, she legally immigrated to the United States from communist China at age 10. So this is somebody with real world experience in both China and the United States. She is the host of China versus the USA podcast, a contributor to Fox News Opinion, NBC News Think, The World Examiner, and The National Interest. There's so much more to this bio, but without further ado, I give you Ms. Ying Ma. Oh, Ying, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Jacob, for that introduction. I want to thank the Federalist Society for hosting me. It's always great to be at a Federalist Society event. When I was in law school, I actually ran a FedSoc chapter for a year, and it was a great experience. I'm a big fan of the organization. I love all the law school chapters. I love all of the organization's chapters across the country. And so it's always great for me to talk to a FedSoc audience. What I am going to do is I'm gonna share a PowerPoint presentation, and then and then we can go through that, and I'll take questions after my presentation. Let's see here. Okay, is everybody able to see my PowerPoint? Or Jacob, you're the only one whose screen I can see. Maybe you can give me a thumbs up. It's actually.
It's working.
All right, well, great, that's great. Okay, so we are gonna talk about US-China strategic competition today, and it's a topic that's obviously in the news quite a bit. When I went to law school, it's funny, you know, China was a very important topic back then already, but one of my fellow students who ran something called the China Law Society or something like that, a lot of times he almost had to beg people to show up to listen to any sort of discussion about China related topics. These days, I think that's a very different, you know, I think the focus is very different. I think there are lots of people who are interested in China, and China takes up a fair amount of our news cycle as well as attention. And so it's US-China strategic competition in particular is something that's become even more important now than it used to be, or at least an increasing number of people are recognizing that it's now more important and something that they should pay attention to. So, so President Biden actually gave a talk today and talked about his infrastructure plan. A while back, when he first got to office in early February, when he made his first foreign policy address, and he talked about a number of things, but one of the things he discussed was China, and he made it clear that meeting the China challenge is going to be a test of American leadership. And he felt that, that we are in a moment of advancing authoritarianism and the growing ambitions of China to rival the United States on the global stage. That is something that the United States will have to meet head on. That is something that we will need to show leadership on. And, he discussed a wide range of areas where we are going to meet this challenge. There are economic issues. There are coercive actions taken by Beijing. There are human rights abuses that China is engaged in on the domestic front. And then there are what we call sort of infringements, intellectual property theft, for instance, that China engages in across the board, but definitely on a very aggressive level here in the United States. And then, there's global governance, China's competition with us in terms of vying for influence at institutions like the WHO, the World Health Organization, China's view of what global governance bodies ought to be, and so on. And so President Biden, when he first came to office, kind of gave a brief indication of what he felt America's relationship with China should be. Now, next slide. Now, there's oddly a great deal of continuity from the last administration. And I say oddly, not because it doesn't make sense, but because President Biden came to office as someone who criticized his predecessor heavily on a wide range of issues. There's, there are very few issues where you can sort of think of and see that President Biden didn't have some amount of disagreement with his predecessor. On the China issue, there's far more continuity than other major policy issues. On President Trump's way out, his Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe, wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal, kind of laying out what many senior Trump administration officials felt. And that was that they felt China posed the greatest national security threat to the United States. And they wanted to, at least some of these folks wanted to make clear to the incoming Biden administration, that is the one thing that they should not forget. Now, from President Trump to Biden, there has been acknowledgement from the Biden administration and senior officials that many parts of President Trump's China policy were actually on the right track. And here's Secretary of State Tony Blinken making comments along those lines when he was testifying at the Senate for his confirmation hearing. And, this is a very broad overview of what they think. Obviously, the details of policy cannot just be summed up in a paragraph or so. But broadly speaking, Secretary Blinken has indicated that President Trump's approach is one that they're not going to just throw out. They may disagree with President Trump's style, especially I think his personal style, but the Biden administration has indicated early on that they are very interested in following through on some of the major contours. Now, so this is a China versus USA is a podcast that I host, and I host it on Ricochet. And for those of you who are interested, feel free to check it out at ricochet.com. And I came up with the name China versus USA. It's pretty simple, it's pretty direct, but I also think that it sums up a big question that we are going to be dealing with for quite some time at the dawn of the 21st century. And it is going to be the most important foreign policy question of our time. And that is, how do we deal with China? Now, in about 7 years ago, I actually hosted a radio show for Hong Kong's public broadcast station, and that's Hong Kong's version of NPR. And at the time, my show had a different title, and it was called China Takes Over the World. And at that time, a lot of people particularly Americans, were a bit taken aback by the show's name because they felt that China was in no position to take over the world. And even though the title of my show was not intended as aspirational, what I was trying to get everybody to understand back then was that China, um, certainly many in the Chinese government, had an interest in expanding their global footprint, and that it is, in terms of the rise of China's global power, that is something that many in the West do not look forward to. The irony is that, in 2020, China actually did take over the world, except it was unintentional. They took over the world by bequeathing the globe with the COVID-19 virus. And that was not really how most people thought China was going to take over the world, but nevertheless, it actually took over the world in a very horrific um, and completely unexpected way. The COVID virus has wreaked havoc, obviously, on the lives of so many people on Earth, and what is jarring about it is that once that happened, China actually openly flaunted its authoritarianism. Not only did it at first blame the US military as the source of the COVID virus, it's engaged in a number of activities that people would find, certainly what a lot of Western governments and particularly people in Washington find quite offensive. And that is that here's a country um, that sought to hide the COVID virus during its initial outbreak. And yet currently it is in some ways bragging about its draconian lockdowns as kind of a superior way of governance. Now, when it comes to China's competition with the US, one of the features of Chinese government that many of us here in the United States and certainly policymakers in Washington object to is China's domestic character, its authoritarianism at home. And so even though China says this is our internal affairs, this is our domestic sovereignty, this is none of your damn business, as far as Washington is concerned, this actually says a lot about who the Chinese leaders are and what the character of their regime is. And so if a country is willing to keep 1 million plus Muslims in internment camps, and if this is something that the State Department refers to as genocide, that doesn't actually speak very well of the regime that's sitting across the table from us in negotiations, and a regime that we seek to deal with on major issues. And of course, there are other challenges, certainly other human rights abuses, from censorship to persecution of domestic critics, and so on. And Hong Kong has become a flashpoint in the US-China relationship, mainly this is because the people of Hong Kong took part in massive pro-democratic, pro-democracy protests, sometimes violent protests in 2019. And the message of those protests could not be more clear. And their message was, we don't want to be just another city in China. We don't want Chinese encroachment in our political system, our legal system, or our society in general. And a lot of young people came out day and night in Hong Kong during 2019, basically asking for, they had a number of demands, but they wanted freedom from the mainland's repressive system. And they wanted freedom from the mainland's encroachments. And so last summer, in the middle of COVID, China actually passed a national security law that essentially ended the one country, two systems framework under which it had promised to govern Hong Kong. And for those of you who don't know, Hong Kong was a British colony for 99 years. And when China and the UK were negotiating Hong Kong's reversion to Chinese sovereignty, China had signed a treaty of, it was an international treaty with the UK in which the Chinese government promised to maintain the one country, two systems framework for the people of Hong Kong. Essentially, after all the massive protests, after the threats they posed to China's system of governance, Beijing essentially just said, aha, we're going to do something very different. And they passed a national security law that essentially erodes much of Hong Kong's existing framework for civil liberties. And then in late February, so essentially, so last month, authorities also decided to conduct a crackdown on the city's democratic political leaders. There is a democratic opposition in the city of Hong Kong, but as a result of their efforts to defy Beijing's encroachments and their efforts to elect more democratic politicians, Beijing decided to brand them as traitors, to brand them for offenses like subversion. And these are new offenses under the new national security law. And many of these political leaders are ended up being rounded up and put in custody in late February. And then just this week, China's legislative body approved some pretty fundamental changes to Hong Kong's political system. Um, and they have pretty much single-handedly altered longstanding electoral rules in the city of Hong Kong. And the end result is that it's going to curtail democratic representation in the city. And then, now we come to some of China's offenses overseas. As far as the United States is concerned, there is grave concern about massive theft and spying. China's intellectual property theft is notorious. There are estimates that it costs America as much as $500 billion a year. That's a massive amount, thousands of dollars for just one US household. Meanwhile, the FBI is regularly opening new China-related counterintelligence cases. Director Ray has said it's about 10 hours, every 10 hours or so. These are massive problems. And I think about 10 years ago, there was concern about these problems amongst policymakers, but I think this is now becoming more and more widespread of a concern amongst Americans in general. And meanwhile, China is not exactly playing nice with its neighbors. It is, the biggest country in its region, and it has a lot of maritime disputes in the South China Sea with its neighbors. It is challenging the freedom of navigation in that in those international waters. And meanwhile, it's becoming threatening Taiwan much more aggressively, and Taiwan is an island that it considers to be an inherent part of China, but the people of Taiwan disagree, and the people of Taiwan have a democratically elected government, and they have zero interest in being part of a communist country. And meanwhile, it's got problems with other neighbors. You guys might have heard of skirmishes that China has been having with India in the Himalayas. Australia trades heavily with China, just as all other countries in Asia do. But but last year, Australia decided to call for an independent investigation into the origins of COVID, and to punish Australia for having the temerity to even suggest that China responded with boycotts on Australian products, as well as a trade war. And so I thought some pictures might be helpful. The South China Sea gets a lot of attention because of the militarization that has been going on, and because there are lots of claimants. China claims about 90%, over 90% of the territory in the South China Sea. A lot of other countries, from the Philippines, Vietnam, as well as others in that area, a lot of them tend to claim an island here, a shoal there. The area is strategic and important because it is home to 2/3 of the world's global shipping. It's not an area where you want someone to, you certainly don't want a country like China to decide one day that it's going to prevent navigation from flowing freely. And but one of the concerns people have is that with all the maritime disputes going on, and so for any particular island, there, so this one here that I show in the picture, Fiery Cross Reef, it's a kind of a tiny speck on the map. It's claimed by four parties: China, Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam. And if you look at the picture on the left, in 2005, that's what it looks like. I mean, it looks almost kind of like it could be a pretty place to visit if it had a few resorts. But then, under China's control, China essentially decided to militarize it. And then on the left, in March 2020, you see a very different picture of what Fiery Cross looks like. And this is what many people are concerned about, when people start seeing things like landing strips, when people start seeing, basically China constructing islands, land reclamation in the middle of the South China Sea. All of those things are highly problematic. And then, of course, China has also been behaving more aggressively in the international waters around these features. And so there's a lot more there's a lot more we can discuss in terms of areas of disagreement between the United States and China. But, let's talk a bit about what the last administration did. A senior State Department official described former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's signature achievement as to reorient American foreign policy toward the challenge presented by China. And this is something that a lot of Trump administration officials seem to be very proud of. There is, however, a disconnect. And even though President Trump is no longer in office, and even though his style was very unique, it's important to recognize what some of these conflicting impulses are, even within the Trump administration, because they manifest themselves perhaps in somewhat different ways in a new administration, but the underlying themes are not always that different. So President Trump himself, actually, for the first 3 years of his administration, described Chinese President Xi Jinping as his very, very good friend. And even though his own administration's national security strategy, this is the first national security strategy that his administration presented in 2017. And basically, this strategy laid out a very different view of China. It basically announced to the world that we've been too naive about the threats and challenges presented by China in decades past, and we had hoped for China's peaceful rise and peaceful integration into the international order, but instead we've gotten an authoritarian regime that has become much more aggressive and much more much more problematic as a geopolitical foe for the United States. And in this national security strategy, the Trump administration said that the United States must rethink the policies it engaged in for the past 2 decades toward China. And of course, those assumptions and those policies from the previous 2 decades include the policies of both Republican and Democratic administrations. This includes the 2 Bush administrations. It includes the Obama administration, under which President Biden served as vice president. And so, the Trump administration folks essentially were proposing a very different outlook and a very different approach to shaping US-China policy. President Trump, I think, saw it somewhat differently. He wasn't always clear in the way he explained his views, but when his administration's national security strategy came out, he in his remarks presenting the strategy, he actually said something quite different. I don't even think he really spent all that much time discussing what was in his national security strategy, but he talked about why he was able to win electoral victory. He felt that Americans had rediscovered their voice and reclaimed ownership of this nation and its destiny. And he wanted to also distinguish himself from a Republican predecessor, and that is President George W. Bush. And President Trump was keen to often say that this country does not wish to impose our way of life on anybody. In some ways, that is a criticism of the kind of regime change that President Bush engaged in Iraq, for instance. Trump often would say, however, that we're still going to champion American values without apology. And so the Trump administration had a number of internal contradictions, and I think the contradictions represented some of the conflicting impulses of the president himself. He saw himself as having great chemistry with Chinese President Xi. Meanwhile, his senior staffers oftentimes acted like the United States had been bamboozled by China for the previous 20 years or so. They felt that many people had expected China to liberalize politically once we began trading with them on a normal basis approximately 20 years ago. But not only did political liberalization did not occur, we're seeing the Chinese Communist Party actually becoming stronger in many ways. And that, I think that view was a view held by a number of folks who were senior Trump administration officials. The question, of course, is are American hopes for Chinese political change Chinese promises? China, the rulers in Beijing had never actually promised that they would democratize in a way that Americans expected. They certainly were eager to embrace reforms, but they wanted to do that for modernization and economic growth. And I think there were and certainly are moderates in the Chinese Communist Party who hope for some amount of liberalization, but the Chinese leadership never promised that, oh, we will, we're going to have one man, one vote, exactly the way that America has today. There's also a bit of amnesia because with the trade war that the Trump administration waged against China, a lot of people kind of have forgotten that when the United States decided to trade with China on a normal basis about 20 years ago, many of the arguments for China's normal trading status with us was that we would end up with a great deal of economic benefits, that China would open its markets to us in unprecedented ways, and that it would advance America's economic interests. Ultimately, some of that did materialize, and not in insignificant ways. We now see China as we now have a situation where China is America's largest trading partner in goods. It's America's third largest export market, and it's America's largest source of imports. I mean, that is a robust, very much interconnected trading relationship and economic relationship. It's also America's largest foreign creditor. It's provided cheap consumer goods for Americans. So, anytime you walk into Walmart and buy something cheap, don't forget that in many ways, the cheap consumer goods come from the kind of trading that we do with China. Now, former President Trump didn't buy any of that. He kept saying to us that China had ripped us off, and I think his criticism of trading with China is actually shared by many in the Democratic Party, particularly leaders who are pro-union. I think this is they're not going to talk about the issue exactly the same way that President Trump did, but there has long been discontent about China and how its cheap imports as well as its low wages have done great damage to our economy, as well as to the manufacturing base in the heartland. President Trump himself, however, has never expressed affinity for former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's rallying cry, which was that America must lead free nations around the world to secure our freedoms from the Communist Party. President Trump has never felt that that was the mission of our time. For him, his tough actions against China were heavily focused on trade and heavily focused on America's economic interests and in preventing China from stealing from the United States, whether they be through cyber theft or through other means. Now, the Trump team, a lot of senior members of the Trump team wanted to reorient the entire US-China relationship to a comprehensive rivalry. And the president, former President Trump, held off for about 3 years. And then once COVID hit, all bets were off because once that occurred, President Trump stood aside and allowed his senior national security advisors to kind of get tough with China across the board. Now, obviously, that was the last administration. There are a lot of features of that administration you're not going to ever see again in another administration. But I think at this at these early days of the Biden administration, there is a question of whether we're going to have a new Cold War with China, and these are still relevant questions. Some critics have said that the Trump administration effectively declared a new Cold War on China during its last year in office. Not only was there a trade war, but there was a barrage of sanctions on large Chinese companies such as telecom giant Huawei, as well as some of the more well-known companies such as TikTok, which a lot of young people here in the United States use. There were conflicts and confrontations on multiple fronts, ranging from closing down their consulates and the Chinese side retaliating in kind, to our spat with them about, the way that they've hidden the source of the beginning of the COVID virus. Now, a number of critics on this approach feel that this could be a self-fulfilling prophecy, and such a Cold War could be problematic because many of our allies are not willing to come along. It's not because they're particularly fond of China, but they don't want a sort of an all-out confrontation, especially since many of them have even closer trading relationships with China, and they're heavily dependent on China economically. And so and so some have argued that if we are going to go ahead, if the Biden administration is going to go ahead and pursue something akin to a new Cold War with China, that could undercut one of our biggest competitive advantages. And that advantage would be, the robust network of alliances and partnerships we have across the globe. So at this point, the question is, what should the Biden administration do? It has already indicated that it intends to continue to be tough on China, even if it's not going to use the same rhetoric as the Trump administration. It does, I think, buy into this view that there is a need to reorient, to continue the reorientation of U.S. policy toward China. However, how tough is it going to get? For those of you who watched Secretary of State Blinken, along with National Security Advisor Jacob Sullivan, meet with their counterparts from China in Anchorage, Alaska, that was pretty recently. That meeting was a complete disaster, at least on the PR front. We, had the Chinese side essentially lecture the United States for about 16 minutes, and they were actually lecturing us about our democracy and our domestic situation. And the Secretary of State didn't actually respond in a way that was particularly uplifting. He kind of started to apologize for some of our internal problems. And certainly there's a great deal of political division within this country right now. But, I think critics are right to ask, why are you apologizing to this country that is in fact committing genocide against, a million plus of its own citizens? And, if we have any need to explain ourselves, certainly, the American people always deserve an explanation from their leaders. But what is the point of apologizing to and explaining ourselves to the Chinese government, which has absolutely no credibility on human rights? Um, Nevertheless, that doesn't mean we should have a Cold War. Robert Zoellick, who is a former president of the World Bank, also a former deputy secretary of state in the Bush administration, he's advocated repeatedly that we don't need a new Cold War with the Chinese, and every relationship relies on diplomacy, and diplomacy cannot always be about confrontation and accusations nonstop. And and there are real costs to what a to what a all to what an all-out confrontation might look like. Some people have advocated decoupling the U.S. and Chinese economy, and there are real financial and economic costs to that. And so one study concluded that if 25% of the tariffs that the U.S. Levies on Chinese goods were expanded to cover to all of two-way trade, the U.S. would forego about $190 billion in GDP. And that's annually by 2025. I mean, these are not small numbers. And decoupling, even though it's something that people are more and more people are talking about, and I don't think that Biden administration would be serious about this. But it's not like something where you can just wave your hand and it happens and there are no consequences, because the linkages between the Chinese and U.S. economy are so intricate and so deep right now. Any form of decoupling could have a grave impact on the American economy. And so what does that mean? It means, I think, that confrontation and cooperation are not, they're not a binary choice. And it is important for those who talk about confrontation with China to remember that China would be a far more formidable enemy than all the countries against which we were engaged in military conflicts in the post 9/11 era, and certainly China would be much more formidable than the former Soviet Union. However, it is also not practical for the United States to just appease China. The communist authoritarian leaders in Beijing can smell weakness. And in many ways, I think the display in Alaska was a manifestation of the way that they kind of smelled weakness from the Biden administration. They know that the Biden administration is much more likely to apologize for its domestic shortcomings, because had that same outburst from the Chinese side happened in the Trump administration, there is no way that Secretary Pompeo or some of the other senior Trump administration officials would have been apologizing for the United States. And so when we talk about the overall relationship, when we talk about the military relationship, national security, for the former number one person at the Navy has said that China is always testing our resolve. And I think that one way of preventing any sort of miscalculation and one way of preventing conflict is not to show the kind of weakness that China is looking for, because as former Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld has said, weakness is also provocative. And ultimately, this relationship requires toughness, it requires moderation, it requires diplomacy. It certainly at times will require confrontation, but at the same time, it will require a softer touch on other occasions. And so the strategic competition is well on its way. A new Cold War is something that's kind of been part of our lingo more and more in the past few years or so, particularly with some of the more confrontational policies taken by the Trump administration. However, let's hope that it does not become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and let's certainly hope that the Biden administration can find the mix of toughness and diplomacy required for navigating this bilateral relationship. And so I will stop there. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Ma. What I think we want to do is if you could throw your questions in the chat, I can then go through those and ask those. You can also use the raise hand function. I believe I have that available. Yeah, so if you want to raise your hand also, then I could call on you in that way. Oh, we got one right away. What would be considered a win in our relationship with China? Or better, can the U.S. manage China, or is the U.S. being managed by China? So I guess two-part. What would be considered a win in our relationship with China? And I guess to rephrase then, does there have to be a hegemonic superpower in this relationship, or can it kind of be both and?
Well, so I think China is at all times kind of pushing. China is keen on expanding its power, not just in its own neighborhood, but certainly in increasing its global footprint, increasing its global influence, and so it's pushing against the United States because currently the United States um, um, is the most powerful country on earth, and inevitably the two countries are going to rub up against each other. I'll take the second part of that question first. I think I think what's happening in the bilateral relationship, it's going both ways. I don't think that it's merely China kind of playing a game, and we're just stepping into China's traps, or we're merely doing China's bidding or anything like that. I think the two countries, oftentimes what happens is there's action, there's reaction, and it happens on both fronts. There's also miscalculation. Um, um, and that is something that we very much want to avoid, because a lot of times you could stumble into a military conflict because you didn't give the proper signals of what your red line is, and so the other side miscalculates. They might do something that you find intolerable, and then military conflict occurs. That's something we certainly would want to avoid, and so signaling clearly is going to be key. But the Chinese also wants to know what the Americans would find tolerable and not tolerable. 10 years ago, China was much less powerful than it is now. And 10 years ago, we were thinking about China differently. And then we were thinking about China even more differently 20 years ago. And so I think there's always going to be kind of a push and pull. And it would be, our job to make sure that the Chinese understand what our red lines are and when not to cross them. In terms of what a win would look like. The Chinese always are talking about a win-win situation for both sides, but people like to joke what they mean is that China would win twice. And it's it sounds great, right? But ultimately, when you get down to it, they're not really interested in having the Americans win. It just sounds great. I think for us. Um, it's a conversation that we do need to have as a country. And one of the reasons I brought up former President Trump's remarks when he presented his national security strategy, and those remarks are kind of very peculiar in a Trump way, but at the same time, it also reflects the American people's exhaustion with foreign interventions, with a lot of endless wars, particularly endless wars in the Middle East. We're still in Afghanistan today. And so ultimately, I think in terms of carrying the weight of being the world's superpower, the American people are going to have a say in how much of that they want to continue to do, how much of that burden they want to continue to bear. And the election of Donald Trump in many ways reflected an increasing reluctance to be engaged in all kinds of foreign conflicts that the American people didn't understand, and to especially commit our troops to places that the American people didn't really care about. I think with China, the American people are increasingly becoming more familiar with it. There's a lot of sort of innate hostility among Americans to the Chinese regime, even if there's, um, sort of an inherent level of friendliness toward the Chinese people. I think a win um, is going to be different depending on the administration. That's depending on the administration that is going to be in power. But that those administrations, every set of political leaders who are in power always end up having to look to the American people for some amount of guidance. I would say number one, on a very basic level, avoiding war um, is a key priority. Right now, we're nowhere near a hot war, but I think it's something that has become um, much less far fetched in the last year or so due to the confrontations with China. I think avoiding war, keeping the peace is very important. Because if that's not avoided, then everybody loses. Um, keeping keeping the American economy vibrant it is going to be a win, and the American people will have to decide, how they want to do that as well. Trading with China became something that was much less popular during the Trump era for very good reasons, because as many on both the left and right had said, China was cheating big time. They were stealing, they were cheating, and they weren't just doing that to us, although they were doing that to us on a massive scale. Um, and so I think ultimately. Um, defending our competitive advantages, defending our values, continuing to um, give our economy and our country the ability to innovate, the ability to compete, and I think peace and security ultimately is a win. But it's going to be a very complicated road toward that goal.
Thank you. I want to go forward with another question from the chat based off of your answer to that last question. And it was, you said a win kind of depends upon the administration. So has the Biden administration taken a stance as to the status or defense of Taiwan, or any actions to help Taiwan?
Um, so actually, let me clarify a bit. What I meant was that I think different administrations will see a win differently. Um, for instance, with the last administration, winning the trade war would have been a big win. Whereas this administration would not place would not place that kind of an emphasis on a trade war, even though the Biden administration has remained um, 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 open to the kind of tariffs that the Trump administration levied, and haven't exactly gone around to cancel, the tariffs wholesale. In terms of what the Biden administration intends to do, I think to them, they want to preserve American global leadership. They want to preserve a world in which a U.S.-led order remains the norm. They want the pursuit of American values, and they want to speak out on human rights issues, which is something that the Trump administration really didn't do a whole lot on. But the Biden administration has indicated that it wants to return to that emphasis. On Taiwan, I think the United States has had a long-standing kind of strategic ambiguity toward Taiwan. We are, committed to selling Taiwan defensive capabilities, and we always want to defend um, um, we always want to defend the Taiwanese people's um, ability to resolve the issue um, and the conflict they have with the mainland through their consent. However, I think what we've done over the years is that we've consistently taken action to deter Beijing um, from threatening the island of Taiwan via military means. So, for instance, in 1990, I guess it was 95 or 96 or so, when Beijing spent a whole lot of time just lobbing missiles across the Taiwan Strait, the United States at that time sent an aircraft carrier to sail through that area, and that was a show of deterrence. And I think over the years we've done things like that in order to deter the Chinese from taking military action or any aggressive action that we felt could end up in a conflict. In terms of what the Biden administration has done on Taiwan, I think they've indicated sort of that they have a firm commitment to peace and security in the region. They haven't come right out. They most U.S. administrations tend not to come right out and say, if you invade Taiwan, we will then go and fight a war against you on the Taiwanese side. Most U.S. administrations, with various exceptions, tend not to say that out loud. And in part, it's to create a certain amount of strategic ambiguity, but they do want to be very clear that, as China starts pushing against the envelope, that we're not just going to stand idly by either. And one of the concerns about Taiwan is that that China's military capabilities for launching the kind of invasion on Taiwan to sort of quote unquote retake control. China's defensive capabilities have actually gotten much, much better at a rate that far exceeded our expectations. And so if we thought some years ago that it would take a few more decades for the Chinese to engage in some sort of invasion to retake Taiwan and bring it back into the fold of the motherland, we might be in a situation where China has that kind of capability in the much nearer future, perhaps, um, um, sort of toward the latter half of this decade or more, or perhaps the first half of the next decade. And so those are considerations that military planners as well as our policymakers would need to be aware of.
Going a little bit further on that topic of this sort of 1959 Tibet-style liberation by the Chinese, or their phrase is liberation. Do you see that happening in like a 2008 Russia into Georgia kind of style with smaller territories like Taiwan, either on the mainland or within this sort of island building campaign in the South China Sea?
So I don't think they could quite do that with Taiwan, because Taiwan does have defensive capabilities, and certainly it's not it's not it's not going to be pretty if the mainland were to invade. The mainland is a lot bigger than Taiwan. However, for a very long time, a lot of military planners also felt that Taiwan had capabilities that could make that could make any kind of invasion like that very painful for the mainland. And of course, if the United States were to come to Taiwan's aid, it it would then immediately change the equation. I think what you're thinking about in some ways has manifested itself in Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong is already part of China, but it was governed under a very different system. It didn't have full democracy, but it had um, um, droplets of it. In fact, some pretty big droplets of it. Part of a number of seats in its legislature were in fact directly elected. By the people, and then in Hong Kong, ever since its handover back to the Chinese mainland, was protected by a legal system that was well respected around the world, and it had civil liberties like the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and a lot of protections that both businesses and individuals relied on heavily. Um, what a lot of people thought after the handover was that China was going to respect that because it had promised to do so. And for many years, I guess it had been 20 some years since the handover. China did respect it. It's just that the protests of 2019, I think, was such a shock to Beijing, and they simply couldn't tolerate that um, that kind of insult, so to speak. And so in many ways, what they have done is they've more or less quashed a lot of the civil liberties as well as the political system that the people of Hong Kong have taken um, have relied on in the past 20 some years and since the handover. And they've done so without consultation with the people of Hong Kong. They've essentially reneged on the bilateral treaty that China has reneged on, the treaty it signed with the UK about, protecting Hong Kong's way of governance until 2047. And it's the government in Beijing has essentially imposed a whole bunch of new laws and legislation on the people of Hong Kong, and so in many ways, Hong Kong is now a very different place compared to 2019. The Chinese, a lot of people. Including some pretty serious China scholars, were telling the world that China's not going to take drastic steps like that to choke off Hong Kong's growth. They really need it, so on and so on. I think one of the things that the Chinese government has shown in the past year or so is that, one, they're not particularly concerned about Western criticism, and two, if they see a threat to their regime, and if they see um, um, the entire city of Hong Kong essentially trying to undermine Beijing's legitimacy, they're going to take swift action, and they really don't care if they actually are going to renege on their past promises. And so I think that might be a better example of what you're looking for. In terms of Taiwan, I think it's more complicated. There are more international players involved. And it would, the cost to Beijing would be much higher.
Thank you for that. I want to turn on maybe a lighter note from hard power to soft power and ask a question about sort of the diplomatic angle of further relations with China. Is there a strategic partner that the U.S. has that China's maybe more friendly to than the United States that could help us in these sort of negotiations? And on the other side, is there someone that we need to be looking out for in diplomacy who is a little more pro-China than maybe we expected?
Um, so, um, so the countries, our allies in Europe, actually are very reluctant to be engaged in the kind of confrontation that we might be engaged in with China. I mean, they're aware of the concerns, they're aware of the threats, and they're certainly aware of things like spying and other problems. But China plays a big role in their economy, even though China is pretty far away, and they don't really want the Americans to drag them into an all-out confrontation. And I think there are a lot of countries in the world where they have a pretty robust relationship with China, with the United States. Perhaps a security alliance or something like that. But meanwhile, China is their number one trading partner, and that puts them in a very difficult position. And so, I think for countries like Europe, sometimes we get very aggravated because they don't do the kind of things that we ask that we hope they would do, and we are not always able to persuade them. Um, and whereas there are other countries like the country of Australia, um, with which we have, Australia as an ally, and but Australia sees us as its number one security partner, but China's Australia's number one trading partner. Um, and so for a long time, Australia's economy um, was fueled in many ways by the demand for growth in China, and the Chinese economy's modernization efforts. A number of other areas that actually brought a great deal of growth to the Australian economy. And I think for a long time, Australia has tried to hedge between the United States and China. But I think in the I think the Australians, however, are perfectly clear-eyed about what sort of regime China is, and the reason that's the case is because they're very close to China. Geographically, they're even closer to China than we are. They see exactly how Chinese Communist Party members sort of try to um, threaten Australians, including sort of Chinese Australians who are living in Australia. They see the economic coercion happening much more close up. And in the past year, as I had indicated in my slideshow, China has essentially waged a trade war against them because Australia wanted some answers about the origins of COVID and they wanted an independent investigation. And so I think we have a lot of interests that are aligned with Australia, and they have been a very reliable partner in the wars that we have waged, including, the recent post 9/11 conflict in the Middle East. I also think that in many ways they are um, um, much more aware of the true character of the Chinese communist regime than a lot of countries are, and they're sort of a middle power too. So if you look at a country like Malaysia, there's a limit of how much that they can do. There are all kinds of smaller Southeast Asian countries that are pretty helpless if China decided um, to truly pressure them. But Australia, even though it's not a great power like the United States, it does have plenty of its own wherewithal. And so I think even and even though there are plenty of domestic voices advocating for different options against China, I think Australia sort of very much understand America's values, America's preferences. And I don't know if I would call it sort of a good middleman, but certainly it's a country that very much sees China clearly for what it is. Whereas I think sometimes our friends, our allies in Europe, might actually be much more hesitant to to take certain actions. Especially regarding trading with the Chinese or doing business with them that might have some sort of national security implications, and we've found all kinds of instances where where we've been a bit unhappy with what our European allies have done.
Thank you for that answer and for sharing your expertise with us today. I know Ms. Ma has another engagement, and so we are going to end this around now, but a very complex topic. We've covered everything from trade to credit to building up islands in the South China Sea, allies, enemies, potential friends. It's a very interesting topic. We've just scratched the surface. The buildup of the Chinese Navy is still on the table, 5G. If you want to learn more about that, you can look up random news, or you can check out China versus the USA, Ms. Ma's podcast. So with that, Ms. Ma, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you very much, Jacob, for hosting me, and thank you everybody for spending an hour with me today. All right, take care.
Thanks for coming, everybody.